reporters used to hang out at the New Jersey Railroad station because it was a way to catch photographs or interviews of famous people coming in and out of New York. And they were told to avoid newspaper reporters. One of them carried a shotgun in a big black case. Just in case he had been confronted by a reporter, he was prepared to tell them that he was going on a duck hunting trip. And the funny thing about that is that we learned later from his children and his biographers that this man never owned a gun. He had borrowed that shotgun just as a decoy and as part of the deception. When they got on board this railroad car, they were told, even in the privacy of this car, not to address each other by last names, first names only. And two of them even went further and refused to address each other by first names. They adopted code names. I thought, well, that seems strange, even in the privacy of Senator Aldrich's car. Well, it turned out that one of the men wrote about it in later years, and he said the reason for that is that they were concerned that the identities of all of these 7 men might be known to the servants on board the car, and that the servants might talk about it. And in that fashion, the word would get out, and then, of course, the purpose of the meeting would have been defeated in their opinions. And so this is the kind of secrecy that surrounded that. Even when they got to the island, and then they got off the train and took the ferry across the inland straits there and went to the clubhouse, they had replaced all of the normal servants with new servants who didn't know any of these people. This is the kind of precautions that went on. And they created the Federal Reserve under those kinds of conditions of secrecy. And then when they came back to New York, and disappeared back into the environs of Wall Street, for quite a while thereafter, these men denied that such a meeting ever took place. They said, oh no, that's just pure rumor. That's nonsense. Later it began to leak out, and they said, yes, we went to the meeting, but we just went to do some hunting and play some poker and drink some good whiskey, that kind of thing, you know. Finally, after the Federal Reserve System was firmly established and became accepted and almost revered in the eyes of Americans as a great American institution, then they finally began to talk about this meeting, who was there, how they went, and why the secrecy. And most of this is now written in their memoirs or in their biographies or in interviews they gave with newspaper reporters and that sort of thing, so that if you go to any well-stocked library today, you can learn in minute detail exactly what happened on Jekyll Island, why they went, who these people were, and especially you will learn why the secrecy. Now, what is the reason for the secrecy? In those days, there was a great deal of concern among the American people about the concentration of financial power in the hands of a few very wealthy and powerful financial interests in Wall Street. They called this the money trust in those days. If you look into the editorials of the time, you'll often find editorials condemning the money trust. And the cry in those days was to break the grip of the money trust. And one of the primary purposes of the Federal Reserve Act, as it was promoted to the American people, was just that, to break the grip of the money trust. They were going to write a law that was going to take the power away from these people and put it in the hands of their trustworthy politicians, you see. Put it in the hands of the people through the electoral process. That was the propaganda behind the Federal Reserve System. So what's the purpose of the secrecy? It's because when you look at the list of these people who went, they were the money trust. They were the representatives of the banks, of J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers. They represented Kuhn, Loeb and Company. They had connections, business relations with the Warburgs in Germany and the Netherlands and the Rothschilds in England. This was the money trust, not only of the United States, but of the world. These are the people who created the Federal Reserve System, supposedly to break the grip of their own power. You see. So now, had that fact been known, who these people were that were drafting the Federal Reserve System, the trick would have been exposed, and the public never would have adopted the Federal Reserve Act as, in fact, they did. Money is created through a process that I call the Mandrake mechanism. Now that goes back to the 1940s when there was a popular comic book character by the name of Mandrake the Magician. He was quite a guy. He had this big black cape, and he could wave it around and things would disappear, and then he'd wave it again and they would reappear. He was quite a magician. And I got to thinking about how money comes into being and how it's extinguished in the United States and much of the rest of the world, for that matter. I thought, aha, that's the Mandrake mechanism. It's magic is what it is. And it really is. It's accounting magic. Here's how it works. Now I'm going to make this very simple, but technically it's totally accurate. It starts with Congress. Remember, a moment ago I said that the Federal Reserve System was a partnership between a cartel and the federal government. Well, if there's a partnership, there's a reason for the partners, both of them, to be in it, or they wouldn't be. So the question is, why is the banking fraternity in this partnership, and why are the politicians in it? And that is answered by understanding how money comes into being. So it starts with Congress, or the government side of the partnership. Congress needs more money. They always need more money. They like to spend money. That gets them elected. They don't like to raise taxes because that gets them unelected. So congressmen and senators are always balancing this choice between how do we give more benefits, how do we buy more votes with the taxpayers' money without raising their taxes. And it's a perennial problem. And the politicians get pretty good at this mechanism. The answer, of course, is that they borrow it. If you're not going to tax it from somebody, you can borrow it from somebody else. That sounds very well and good, and that's why we have government bonds and treasury notes and bills and so forth, and we have what's called the national debt, because they've borrowed money to pay for current expenses that they don't want to pay for through taxes, because that would be unpopular. Well, fine as far as it goes, but when you borrow money, eventually you have to pay it back. See? So 30 days after they borrowed $1 billion, or 60 days, whatever the term of the loan is, or a year, they have to pay that money back. Well, lo and behold, it turns out that the congressmen and the senators are still not taking in as much money in taxes as they are spending in benefits, so they don't have the money to repay the loan. So what do? Easy. Borrow some more. Borrow enough to pay back the original loan, plus a little bit more to keep them in office, keep them with the image of the big spenders. So this process goes on and on and on, and that's why we have the national debt growing and growing and growing. So far, so good. If you borrow money from somebody who has the money, you don't really increase the money supply. All you're doing is just taking it from one person and promising to pay back interest on it. But the money supply doesn't increase. The Federal Reserve enters the picture at this stage because, you see, they can never borrow enough from the private sector. There's never enough existing money out there for the politicians to borrow without having to raise the interest rate very, very high to attract it, which is also politically unpopular. So they don't want to do that either. So what do? They go to the Federal Reserve System, and by agreement, remember this is their partner now in this agreement, the Federal Reserve System agrees literally to create the money that they're going to lend to the government. It's not really a lending at all, as you can see, but they use the old traditional words of lending it to the government, when in fact all they're doing is just printing it for the government. They're creating it for the government, and then they call it a loan. Of course, they don't print it all because most of it's checkbook money, but nevertheless, the process is the same as if they had just turned on the printing presses and printed all this money and gave it to the federal government. And then they were going to loan it to the federal government and charge the government an interest on it, and that's a misnomer either. What they should really say is, we've created it for the federal government, and now we want a service charge. That's an accurate understanding of what is really going on. But instead, they confuse it by saying that it's a loan and interest. So now, once the Federal Reserve System creates this money out of nothing, literally, it's fresh money into the society, into the economy, and that's how the money supply keeps growing and growing and growing. Now that's just the beginning, though.